senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. He is a weekly columnist for Bloomberg and The National, which is a daily from the United Arab Emirates, and is also a regular contributor to many other US and Middle Eastern publications. He's literally made thousands of radio and television appearances and was the Washington, D.C. correspondent for the English language Daily Star from Beirut. Or of Beirut, I guess. Many of Dr. Ibish's articles are archived on his Ibish blog website. His most recent book is What's Wrong with the One-State Agenda, Why Ending the Occupation and Peace with Israel is Still the Palestinian National Goal. I should note in this connection that he was included in all three of Foreign Policy's Twitterati 100, where the magazines, which is much more prestigious than it might sound at first, depending on what if you're aware of Twitter, that's what that means. So the Twitterati 100, the magazine's list of 100 must follow Twitter feeds on foreign policy. Ibish is the editor and principal author of 3 major studies of hate crimes and discrimination against Arab Americans. He's also the author of At the Constitution's Edge, Arab Americans and Civil Liberties in the United States in States of Confinement, among with several other publications.
Right.
Dr. Ibish previously served as senior fellow at the American Task Force on Palestine, and as executive director of the Hala Salam Maqsood Foundation for Arab American Leadership. He also served as communications director for the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee and holds a PhD in comparative literature from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Once Dr. Ibish is finished talking to us about the so-called Abraham Accord, I have asked my distinguished colleague, Professor Jemshid Choksi, to act as discussant. He has graciously agreed. If I may give just a very brief introduction to Dr. Choksi. He is distinguished professor of Central Eurasian Studies at Indiana University, where he's professor of Iranian Studies and is a Sesame affiliate. With that, I hope you will forgive me, Dr. Choksi, for that very expurgated introduction. With that, by way of formalities, let me turn the afternoon over to Dr. Hussein Ibish.
Thank you, Dr. Slabadi. I'm really grateful to you for inviting me to join you today here at virtually Indiana University. And I just want to say I'm particularly grateful because, I really wanted you at that panel where we met almost 20 years ago. I kind of insisted on it, and I'm so glad you were able to be there. And in addition to which, I've admired you for so long because along with a couple of other people, and I had the pleasure of being last week with Aaron David Miller, and I said the same thing to him, but there are only maybe 5 or 6 other people I would say this to. I really admire you as a practitioner and as a scholar, and that's unusual. Usually people are good at one and not the other, but in your case and in Aaron's case, there's a crossover, which is a rare thing. So
you're very kind. Thank you.
No, not at all. I mean, absolutely sincere. So let's look at, I'm going to look at the Abraham Accords, or whatever it is. The probably the most technically accurate way to put it would be, not in any kind of packaging, but simply what it is, the diplomatic normalization process between Israel, the UAE, and Bahrain. And they are different. They are different processes. They exist for different reasons. They're deeply connected, but to conflate them all into one phenomenon, the Abraham Accord is marketing for the Trump campaign, basically, and others. And I think it's not really accurate. So let me step back for a second and look at the context in which this is taking place, right? Why is this happening now? Well, I think the big picture is a global and a macro historical phenomenon that in this context is probably best expressed as strategic diversification. We are navigating the process, a process that was inevitable, a process you could and did and would have predicted at the fall of the at the end of the Cold War, with the fall of the Soviet Union, the emergence for a time of a monopolar American-dominated world that would abate as other powers rise and turn into a more complex, more variegated, multipolar world. Now, I think we started exiting the monopolar world sometime back, right? Probably sometime after the invasion and occupation of Iraq, if not a little bit before. And we are now well and truly in the process of developing the beginnings of an actual multipolar reality. It's not there yet. The United States is still the dominant power militarily, economically, probably in some ways culturally, but you can see not just that waning, you can see the alternative emerging. So that puts smaller countries like the UAE and Bahrain and Israel and just about everybody else, including European states and others, in the position of rethinking, who've been oriented to the United States, in the position of rethinking their strategic, their grand strategy, the way they position their resources and their national organization to secure their basic national interests. And the inevitable corollary to all of that is a program of strategic diversification. It can look very different in different places, but I think that's the watchword. And I think it accurately describes what at heart Israel and the UAE and Bahrain are all doing here. When you get to the point where even, just to stay in the Gulf region for a second, where even Kuwait, which for decades now has had a foreign policy of, well, we're with the United States, and that's it. And then that kind of evolved into, we're with the United States and we're a mediator because we don't want these conflicts to come and disrupt our society. But when even they are considering strategic diversification and gaining a wider set of options through alliances, you're talking about a very comprehensive condition of strategic diversification. So, I mean, this is, I think, something to be borne in mind here. In other words, this is part and parcel of the emergence of a post-American Gulf region and Middle Eastern region and world. And that doesn't mean the United States is not a crucial part of it and won't be for a time the preeminent power, and maybe for a long time, conceivably. And that the United States is going to become a minor power anytime in the imaginable future, certainly anytime in the next century. I think it's very hard to imagine that. But it means the United States as the defining global guarantor, the guarantor of global and regional stability in key places, is coming to an end. And I think it's fair to say one of the reasons it's coming to an end is not just a relative decline in American power and leverage and options. There's also a certain lack of will in the United States. That's most poignantly expressed in terms of the Middle East and the Gulf region. But generally speaking, nobody in the foreign policy establishment, or let me put it differently, the foreign policy establishment as a collectivity has never properly attempted to explain to the average American, to the American voters, what is in it for them in this global leadership, global engagement business. Instead, demagogues on the far left and the far right have been hammering them with decades of propaganda about it's all a ripoff. You're being ripped off by oligarchs in the United States, rich people, cynical politicians, evil foreigners, friend and foe, like everyone's bad, everyone's stealing your money. And ordinary Americans feel ripped off. And so it sounds like it makes sense. And no one has tried to make the case of them post-Cold War, right? And I think during the Cold War, people got it. They got even maybe an exaggerated sense of the extent to which the Soviet Union was a threat to their way of life and their well-being and their prosperity. They got it maybe in spades. But with the Soviet Union gone, the case has simply not been made. So on top of everything else, there's a lack of will. And the US has acquired successively some really bad reputations under 3 presidents in a row. George W. Bush, who made the United States look imprudent, is a nice way of putting it, with this hubristic post 9/11 foreign policy. Barack Obama, who made the United States look feckless and unreliable as an ally, with various policies, including abandoning Mubarak and backing off the red line in Syria, not getting involved in Syria at all. And in some eyes, the JCPOA, not in others, not necessarily in mine, but for some people, yes. And now you have Trump. The kindest way of putting it would be to say wildly unpredictable. That would be the nicest way. The harsh way would refer to some kind of mental disturbance, an unpredictability to that extent. But I mean, the point is, you can have fire and fury aimed at Pyongyang one day, and now I'm in love with the same guy, and nothing changed, except the politics, maybe. I don't. Anyway, the point is, none of these three presidents has helped to repair the image of the United States. So while we have roughly the same kind of profile in the region that we did, in terms of objective standards, even investments, or less investments, but militarily, diplomatically, et cetera, there's a similar, footprint. It's much greater than the Russian footprint, but Russia, because it's willing to invest its energy in very calculated ways and to be everyone's interlocutor, has emerged as everyone's go-to interlocutor, because, I mean, among other things, it has the will to do it, and we don't. Right. Now, why the UAE and Bahrain? Different reasons, right? I think people conflate them a lot, but they shouldn't. The UAE is Isaiah Berlin's fox, and Bahrain is Isaiah Berlin's hedgehog. The fox knows many things, and it's got lots of agendas, and it's going around. And that's the UAE in this agreement with Israel. Bahrain is a hedgehog. It knows one thing, but it knows it really well. And Bahrain's hedgehog idea, is Iran. And that's it. Iran poses, I think, from a Bahraini government point of view, a unique, or Bahrain faces a uniquely existential threat from Iran. Iran is widely perceived to be threatening by many of its neighbors, but very few of them perceive the kind of existential threat that the Bahrain government does. Because Bahrain has been claimed in whole as part of Iran by the Shah, who even tried to seize Bahrain when it was becoming independent and was beaten off by the United States and Britain. Then he renounced that claim. During the Islamic Republic, some people have resurrected that claim from time to time. And from a Bahraini nationalist point of view, it looks like you're living on a suspended death sentence from Iran. And that's how it feels. In addition to which, Bahrain has this large, alienated, marginalized, oppressed in many ways Shiite majority. And the Iranian intelligence services have had a lot more luck getting inroads into extreme wings of the Bahraini Shiite political movement than they have anywhere else in the Gulf. Weapons have been sent, there are operatives there, etc. So it looks much more threatening. And in short, it makes perfect sense for the hedgehog Bahrain to get in bed with and form a working alliance with the country that's doing most of the heavy lifting militarily in the Middle East against Iran's regional proxies, which are its main method of projecting its power in the region. That is to say, Israel has been conducting consistent airstrikes for its own reasons, but they're useful to a country like Bahrain in a very indirect way, but in a materially indirect way, against Hezbollah and Hezbollah-related groups and other pro-Iranian militias in Syria. And they've extended that to Iraq as well. And I think they've been clear that they're willing to pick up in Lebanon if need be additionally. And none of this necessarily comes as good news to a lot of people in the Arab world, but it sounds pretty good in Bahrain, because if you think this is beating back your existential threat, you might be really interested in having a dialogue with those people. In fact, you would be, and indeed they are. Now, it is important to note that the UAE agreement came first, but also it's different. It's substantially different than the Bahrain agreement. There's this, when they met together on September 15th in the White House, they signed, a kind of, how should you put it, an aspirational document full of good wishes. And it really read, it was so idealistic that it read like it was drafted in Abu Dhabi, and it probably was. It was Abu Dhabi-tastic, if I could put it that way. Abu Dhabi is very good at lofty rhetoric about humanistic goals, and it read that way, and I think it was. But it didn't have any programmatic agenda. The UAE signed a separate programmatic agenda in terms of rollout with Israel. And in fact, it began a little earlier than the 15th of September with a financial committee set up. But now they're going into direct flights, and there are, cultural and sporting and other arrangements are being made. And there's a timetable, there's a clear formula, and it looks like a reasonably fast track if all goes well. We'll talk about the pitfalls in a second, potential pitfalls. Bahrain just signed its substantive agreement with Israel a couple of days ago. Very low key in Manama, Israelis and a couple of Americans, including the venerable U.S. peace negotiator Ari Berkowitz, who's kind of wizened old veteran of all kinds of diplomatic achievements. But anyway, he was there. What a summer internship he's having. But it's a less ambitious agenda, and I think the reason is that the UAE would have gone ahead. The UAE faces virtually no risks here at least in terms of domestic politics, and even regionally, I think they think it's a very good idea. Bahrain does face risks because they have a much more diversified population, a much more robust, the remnants of a much more robust civil society. They had a more robust, and it's still there to some extent. I mean, there was a group of 17, I believe it was, civil society groups and political societies, which is what they're called in Bahrain, that signed an objection. The biggest ones pulled out at the last minute, but it was there. There's been nothing like that in the UAE. In addition to which, there's that issue of the angry Shiite minority. You have Islamists in Bahrain, including Muslim Brotherhood groups who operate in the open still to this day, Al-Minbar. And you have, of course, the whole range of Shiite opposition groups, from nationalistic but religiously Shiite all the way to Vilayat al-Faqih guys who, really have one foot in prison. But they're all there. And then the underground movement as well. And so, so this is much riskier for Bahrain politically. So that's one reason why they would sign a much less ambitious agreement. The other is that the UAE does what it wants, but Bahrain is a protectorate of Saudi Arabia, right? The causeway that exists between Bahrain and Saudi Arabia makes Bahrain a de facto province of Saudi Arabia, a de facto government. And in terms of foreign and defense policy, they defer to Riyadh. And I think it's almost unimaginable that, it's certainly true that Bahrain has become much closer to the UAE in recent years, especially to Abu Dhabi. That's for sure. But I still think it's true that they would not have done this fairly drastic thing, this ambitious, dramatic thing, without Saudi approval. So there's also a sense in which the Bahrain experience serves as a test case for Saudi Arabia. And I'll come back to the Saudis in a couple of minutes. So what's the UAE Fox's set of agendas? It's complex, as I mentioned. Well, first and obviously, it does involve strengthening the coalition against Iran. And I think that's obvious, and that's what everybody noticed, and it's perfectly true. But I think it's also true that Israel and the UAE are two of the members of a much smaller coalition, which regards Turkey and its proxies as a rising threat of a similar kind, and potentially, eventually, of a similar degree, and maybe even worse, as Iran poses to the region. They view the Sunni Islamist movement in the Middle East as having once been loose and in Kuwait and underground, etc., as having been increasingly drawn into Turkish foreign policy and increasingly becoming a tool and a cat's paw of Turkish foreign policy. That Turkey is now clearly the leader of this coalition that includes Qatar and includes Muslim Brotherhood parties all over the region, Hamas, the GNA government in Tripoli and Libya, etc. It's not a huge coalition, but it's a significant one, and it has a lot of potential public appeal insofar as the Muslim Brotherhood does in the Arab world and elsewhere, and possibly on other bases as well. Turkey is a very significant power, and potentially more significant than Iran. It has much deeper roots in the Arab world, and it's much easier to peddle a kind of Sunni agenda than a Shiite one in much of the Arab world. So, you know, there are some advantages, not to mention NATO, Turkey's economic strength, etc. It's all sort of obvious, you know. A lot of countries aren't as alarmed. Saudi Arabia is not as alarmed. They are alarmed, but they're not as alarmed. Many countries are not that alarmed. But UAE, Israel, Sudan, and Egypt are. That's the bloc I'm talking about, right? And it's also one of the reasons why Sudan is very likely to be, next. And this bloc really wants to come together. Not only, not only prompts strengthening the bloc against Iran is one agenda that brings Israel and the UAE together, but also strengthening the bloc confronting Turkey is another agenda. And they're not the same. They're very different. Another reason is the UAE wanted to reach out to not only the Trump administration, but to Democrats in Washington. They wanted to fix things with Democrats, with Pelosi and Schumer and Biden's people. And I think they realized this would go over really well with Democrats, even if it looks like something that will help Trump, because it is exactly what mainstream Democrats would have wanted them to do. And the Democrats responded instantaneously, very positively. I'm not talking about the Democratic left. I'm talking about the Democratic center, the ones who will be in power if Biden wins, as seems increasingly plausible. And I would say probable at this point, though who knows? But it's looking good for him, and therefore for them. And they were very tired of being put in the same basket on all issues every time with Saudi Arabia. That everyone in Washington would just say UAE and Saudi Arabia. And so UAE would be swept up in all the scandals that the Saudis were enmeshed in. The Yemen war, even though the UAE was getting out of it, even though the UAE's war in the south was not similar to the Saudi war. I mean, it overlapped a bit, but a lot of differences between what they were doing in Saudi Arabia and what they were doing in Yemen, and Saudi Arabia was doing in the north of Yemen. In addition, obviously the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the campaign of repression going on in Saudi Arabia, the jailing of dissidents, women's rights activists like Lojen Hatlal and others. I mean, this outrageous conduct that they really don't have anything to do with. And I think the message they were sending to the Democrats is, we're not the same, we're different, and we're better. And I really think they want to send that message. In addition, they want weapons. They want the F-35 system. I'm one of those people who thinks they'll get it. We'll see. I also think Biden will have an easier time getting it for them than Trump, because there'll be fewer people against it. I think the Republicans would still want to consolidate this achievement, and most Democrats would not fight Biden over this thing. So I would suggest they would get it. They also want the Predator drones, the ones that took out Qasem Soleimani and Al-Muhandis at the Baghdad airport. Most unfortunate choice of venue for that. I agree with that. But it proved the point from a military point of view is very efficacious. It's a very effective weapon. With the right guidance system, that drone is a highly effective tool of assassination. And I think they want to be part of that. They want the big game changer here, which people are not focusing on, is the Growler electronic warfare system, right? Electronic warfare is really important for this small country that is very aggressive militarily, and it doesn't have a lot of people. It has a powerful air force already. It has very competent special forces, and probably the best regular military ever in the modern Arab world. We could have a really interesting discussion about whether Hezbollah is more effective, which is halfway between a guerrilla and a conventional, versus the special forces of the UAE. The point is, for the military of an Arab state, they've been very successful in what they've tried to do. But electronic warfare is very important for them. And they want this Growler electronic warfare plane. They want to be able to jam people. They want to be able to disrupt. They feel very vulnerable. And so having THAAD, which is a missile defense system, and Patriots, which is a missile defense system, both of which they have their eyes on two things: Growlers for jamming and disruption of precision guidance, which the Iranians showed they were really masterful at using in the attacks on the Saudi Aramco sites at Abu Kek and Khurais. That was very impressive, right? I think 2 missiles missed. It was fantastically good, which means you want to prepare not to be targeted that effectively. And the Growlers are supposed to help you do that. And then I think they may be hoping in the long run to be able to get Israel's Iron Dome system, a much more short range, effective kind of localized small missile system, which they've developed to deal with Hezbollah and Hamas rockets, in connection with the United States. And whether that'll ever happen or not, I don't know, but I don't think there's any doubt that UAE is thinking potentially about the value of having an Iron Dome system of their own. And I don't think there's any doubt that Israel would be very interested in figuring out a way of getting its own personnel on the ground in the UAE right next to Iran for various military purposes. So while it's a long shot in many different ways, I don't think that's off the table either. And then finally, UAE sees itself as a tech hub, right? It's got a Mars mission going on. It's got a moon probe coming. It's really gone into the high tech in a big way. And it looks around the region and it says, who can we partner with? And the only real answer is Israel. And they're very interested, especially in things like electronic warfare, cyber surveillance, stuff like that. Exactly the kind of stuff the Israelis have focused on. And then the commercial applications that follow and the scientific R&D. And this is part of their post-energy agenda. So for them, it makes real sense. So that's, there's more, but I'm going to stop there with the Fox because the Fox can be dizzying, and that's plenty to be working on. So what comes next here? Well, the short list is almost exactly the same as the long list, right? The short list of Arab countries that might do this. There are other Gulf countries that would consider doing it, and a couple in Africa. Sudan is likely to be next. Why? Well, because Sudan is part of that coalition confronting Turkey. It is very close to the Egyptian government and very close to the UAE government. It relies on the UAE for that. It desperately needs to get off the state sponsors of terrorism list that the White House has linked to this agreement in a way that I think is unconscionable and idiotic and horrible. But, you know, they have done it, and that's Khartoum's problem. They have no business being on that list whatsoever, but there they are. They've got to get off of it, because if they have any ambitions, they need that. And they've been very blunt. They've been blunt that they need the Israelis. So what I think you can expect from Sudan is something less even than Bahrain has done, but something significant diplomatically that kicks the ball, and maybe a commitment to eventually normalize at some point. I'm not sure. They're going to cut a hard bargain. They're going to want a lot of money, which they need. They're going to want to get off that list, which they need. They're going to want support from Washington, from probably from Israel, certainly from the UAE. I mean, without question, they need to get paid here because they're in real trouble, and they also need technical help in various fields. Right? So they're going to expect all of that, and I don't think they're going to sell themselves short either. They have this great excuse that, you know, they're just a transition government, and this is a time, and they can easily put this off with perfectly credible reasons that actually I think are the ones that hold Oman back. Oman is transit. Oman is the next country on this list. I should mention Morocco would like to do this too. So Morocco is the other country in Africa, and it has its own reasons, and I'm not going to belabor you with those reasons. But it does. You know, the cost for Morocco would be very low, extremely low. So why they wouldn't do it, I don't know. And in fact, I believe eventually they will. Now back to the Gulf. Oman is ready to do this, but Oman is involved in a very complicated transition. Independent Oman had one leader for almost its entire history, that's Sultan Qaboos, and he recently passed away, and now you have a new leader, Sultan Haytham, and it's a really complicated transition, and I think it's held them back from like this. If any headache they can avoid, I think they'd like to avoid it. They just don't need more on their plate. And so I think they will go for it, but they'll go for it when they can, when they go for it. I think the really it's worth mentioning that Kuwait will not do this. So they'll be the last to. They say they'll be the last to do it, and I totally believe that, because Kuwait's, as I mentioned in the beginning, Kuwait's policy is don't bring in any disputes that can disrupt Kuwaiti society, and this definitely could do that. Lots of Islamists in the Kuwaiti parliament, lots of well-integrated Shiites who need, you know, shouldn't be riled up, lots of liberals, lots of all kinds of people who might object. So I think I take the Kuwaitis seriously that they're just not interested, and for them it doesn't make much sense. The interesting case on the short list is Qatar, because Qatar went further than anybody else before the UAE in establishing diplomatic links with the Israelis. The Israelis had a trade mission. They had a kind of diplomatic relations with Qatar in the late 90s, between 96 and 98. They had a trade mission in Doha, which is a kind of full recognition diplomatic relations. And it got cut off and what have you. But I think the Qataris would love to do it, but they are, in the context of the boycott that's been going on for the past few years, really dependent on Turkey, really dependent on Iran. I don't think they're in any position to do it, but I think if they can find the wiggle room, they would. The real question is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the only country that isn't on the short list and isn't on the long list. Because the long list is really a long list. Everything I said about Kuwait applies pretty much to everybody else in the Middle East and more. I mean, it's harder even to imagine Syria or Lebanon going there, etc. So, you know, there are various degrees of length, but I would put everybody else on the long list for this being something into the future. Now, I think Saudi Arabia is held back by a generational disagreement between the King Salman, who is a traditionalist, who is committed to Palestinian rights, who has a real interest in the Arab Peace Initiative, more on that in a minute, and who's just not ready to go there. I think his son, the Crown Prince, MBS, is emotionally ready to go there, and he's made that very clear. But my point is this: Saudi Arabia has to worry about a whole bunch of things most of these other countries don't. They have to worry about their Arab standing, but they don't necessarily want Arab leadership. I don't really think they did, and now it's been forced on them by the fact that the traditional centers of power in Cairo, Damascus, Baghdad are, as Aaron, my friend, put it, offline. Their bandwidth is gone. They're not. At most, the Egyptians are minding their borders, and the other two are even less able. They can't even mind their own borders. So, you know, the Egyptians can take care of like Libya and Gaza and the oil issue and things, but it has to be adjacent to them or they don't really get involved. So Saudi Arabia has that problem. They also have the problem they want, and they always wanted, which is global Islamic leadership. But they're confronted by two constant rivals, right? Turkey and Iran, who harass them constantly and at the organizational level, there's a bloc that's formed between Turkey, Pakistan, and Malaysia to confront Saudi control and pose alternatives, threaten alternatives, be an alternative. And sometimes they're supported by Iran and sometimes they're not, depending on the issue. But this is all a big headache for Saudi Arabia, considering itself to be the natural leader of the Muslims for various you know, implausible reasons like history and geography and being more extreme than anybody else historically, but not anymore. And I don't know, well, whatever reason you want to make up, right? It's a claim. The others all have, you know, very dubious claims. And then finally, they have much more complicated politics in Saudi Arabia. They are not a small country. Geographically, they're a big country. Yes, there's a Rub al Khali. Yes, there's a lot of empty stuff there, but there are some people there, and there are 30+ million Saudis, and there's a lot of diversity in the Saudi population. There are regional divisions, cultural divisions, sectarian divisions. There's the Eastern Governorate province where much of the oil is, which has a Shiite majority. It's not a Bahrain-like incendiary situation, but, you know, it's all risky for them. So the calculation, even for someone like MBS, will be made at the moment, and it will be a very complicated reckoning, much more complicated than for any of these other countries, the smaller neighbors or far-flung powers like Morocco. Right. Final point I want to make before turning over to Dr. Jamshid is, what about the Palestinians? Where does this all leave the Palestinians? Well, up the creek without a paddle is exactly where it leaves them, right? And it's to a very large extent their own doing, because over the past 5 to 8, 9 years, if you asked Palestinian leaders and leading Palestinians who are plugged into the PLO and say the more plausible part of their leadership, what's your national strategy, for liberation and freedom? You would get either a direct invocation of the Arab Peace Initiative as they understood it, or a description of the Arab Peace Initiative without the words Arab Peace Initiative. So they put all their eggs in that basket. And it's kind of crazy. I mean, I understand, I really appreciate how few options Palestinians have and how dependent they are on support and all that. But to give your national project, to frame it around an agenda that is not only controlled by others, but defined by others, is pretty reckless stuff. And they did do that, in fact. So now, the Arab Peace Initiative in the beginning sort of drew a relationship between normalization, diplomatic outreach to Israel, et cetera, and ending the occupation, the creation of a Palestinian state to live alongside Israel. Right? But it was initially framed as occupation first, normalization after. Then it was revised in the past few years by some of the Arab countries in practice as mutual steps. You ease the occupation, we'll diplomatically outreach to you, and we'll create a virtuous circle, and then full recognition and ending the occupation will happen more or less in concert. That was the idea. It didn't really happen. Now, UAE and Bahrain, especially UAE, have flipped the scenario entirely, where it's normalization first and maybe something about the occupation later, as long as you don't try to annex any territory until the end of 2024, as I understand it. That's a secret agenda, but I hear from everyone the same date, end of 2024. And it's an agreement, by the way, with the United States, not with Israel, but it's a way of getting the Israelis to agree. Because I think they wouldn't take those measures without Washington's support. And they don't know if they'll have it in 2024. The point is they were more interested. And I think they had an 80% Israeli public support for normalization over annexation. And when 80% of Israelis agree on anything, it's a miracle. So this is really an incredible endorsement of that choice by Netanyahu and everyone in Israel. So this leaves the Palestinians in the position of having, functionally speaking, no national strategy for liberation. Hamas says it wants armed struggle until victory, maybe with a hudna, some sort of a truce in between. This is silly from the beginning. The PLO says it wants to negotiate a two-state solution with Israel, and they always used to say via the API. So now we're back to negotiate a two-state solution with Israel. But there are no negotiations. And now there's no API, at least the API as they understood it, as they defined it. So they're without that. So now all they've got is internationalization. But, again, it's about as powerful as a wet Kleenex. It just is not going to produce, even maybe less effective in getting results than armed struggle, which is entirely counterproductive. So, or at least has been historically. So I think it puts the Palestinians in a situation where, functionally speaking, they have no national strategy anymore for liberation, and at least no workable one. And they have an urgent need to develop one that they control, and an urgent need to fix their politics. And by the way, I mean, I'm perfectly happy to discuss this, but what it all reveals is they don't even have a national leadership anymore. None of these major actors are national leaders. Most of them don't even aspire to be national leaders. And I think that's where we are. Okay, I'll stop there and welcome your response, Professor Jamshid, and then everybody else.
Thank you, Hussein. I hope everyone can hear me. Hussein, thank you. Extremely comprehensive. And in fact, made many of the questions I had planned to ask obsolete. You really, truly, gave us not just a superb overview, but also great depth. But I'd like to focus, therefore, on just a few, actually three issues. Firstly, Oman. Oman has prided itself, particularly under the last Sultan, in being the middleman, in negotiating between the groups. How would that shift if they entered into an agreement? So that's the first question I'm going to throw out.
It's a good question.
The second then brings in Qatar. If Qatar were to make this jump, certainly it may patch up relations that are soured with the Emirates, etc. But then how does this leave Qatar economically with Iran, particularly in terms of the very large gas field that is shared? So that's the second. And finally, Saudi Arabia. I mean, we've been seeing this sort of gradual shift in the last few weeks, newspaper op-eds in Saudi Arabia, overflights, particularly the overflight from the El Al flight to Bahrain, which had others, another person we can mention is Minuchian in there.
Yes.
Yeah. And when I bring these three nations up, if they were to link in, so my fourth question would be, how does this work in terms of this at least being perceived as an American initiative, particularly as an initiative by the Trump administration, with all the chaos that administration has sown around the world and in the Middle East? So I'll stop at that point. I look forward to your responses and then the other questions. So thank you so much.
Okay, terrific. Well, these are excellent questions. So let me take them exactly the order that you asked them in. I think they're extremely sort of perceptive. So Oman. All right. I think of all the Arab countries, Oman is the most natural in terms of outreach to Israel, because Oman's strategy for a long time, much more than Kuwait, is to see itself as the interlocutor, as the bridge. And also, Oman has been granted the bandwidth to do that, the leeway to do that by the other GCC countries in a way that others might not have been. It is, in Gulf Cooperation Council terms, the outlier geographically, culturally, religiously. And I think it was always understood that it's better to have the Omanis inside working with you than outside working against you. And having Oman, for example, Oman served as the host of the initial meetings that helped Iranian diplomats and American officials transition from a European-Iranian dialogue for the second time, this is really how it goes, to an American-Iranian dialogue that eventually produced the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement that is so controversial, I guess, at least in the United States. That is something that could have annoyed the other Gulf countries, but it didn't. And the main reason it didn't, or didn't very much, is that Omani participation in those kind of conversations gives the Gulf countries a foothold in discussions which they would otherwise be totally excluded from. So this is very useful from their point of view, and they were used to it. And a lot of anger in politics a lot of times comes from expectations, right? If you expect loyalty and you don't get it, it produces one reaction. If you don't expect loyalty and you expect people to go off and do their own thing and you think it could benefit you in a roundabout way, you don't have to reconceptualize why that might be useful. You just say, well, that's them. That's what they're there for. That they, So in a way. So I think the idea of the Omanis being close to the Israelis is a very natural one in terms of mediation. And, Netanyahu paid an official visit to Oman a couple of years ago, where he was greeted by Sultan Qaboos himself. And the only thing was, it wasn't publicized until after Netanyahu had left. So that was a slightly unusual feature of it. Usually people say, an important regional head of state is here before they go, and they don't keep it quiet until after they've left. But the willingness is very much there, and it caused no pushback in Oman, and pretty much none in the rest of the GCC either. I mean, no one was surprised. So with Oman, I really think it's a matter of timing. The tough thing in these kind of gestures is to go first. And I think the UAE went first because it has all those reasons that I mentioned, and some more that are not so fascinating, for wanting to do this. And UAE has a leadership that is bold without being reckless, or very reckless anyway, and that it likes to do, move fast and break stuff kind of thing. And they see themselves as, they don't seem to have taken on any of the uh, complexes that went along with the defeat in 1967. Qatar too, by the way. They also don't seem to. So it's kind of a very un-Arab Arab country, very not post-67 Arab country. So they went ahead and did it. That opened the door for Bahrain, who saw the sky didn't fall in, and then it was much easier for the Saudis to give them permission to do this, something they wanted to do for their reason. And now I think it's a matter of people, it's for the short list that I mentioned, it's a matter of getting the price right and the timing right. And that's all it is. The one country which, as I say, is not in the short list or the long list is Saudi Arabia. It's in this gray zone. And it's because they'll have to decide. But I think Oman is again, it's a matter of time. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that they're in this transition from one very long time. I mean, almost all of their modern history was under one man who did everything. I mean, the next highest ranking person was the deputy prime minister, and then the typist. So it was, it's a big lift to go to any other human being. Qatar. Right. So Qatar, I think, also sees itself as a great mediator. But this has changed a little bit because Qatar, after the Arab Spring, was seen very much as taking sides with they would say with the revolutionaries and with the Democrats, but from the point of view of their rivals, it wasn't with the liberal students and the Democrats, it was with the Muslim Brotherhood. And I kind of think that that criticism is correct, actually. And it eventually led them into a situation where they became more and more antagonistic with their neighbors for really complicated reasons. If anybody wants me to discuss why the boycott happened and the different motivations, I will. But I think it takes us too far afield. My point is that has forced them into a position of greater dependency on Turkey, where they've become notably the junior partner, whereas before they were not, and much closer ties with Iran. You mentioned what the Qataris call the North Field, and I believe the Iranians call South Pars, the natural gas field that provides almost all of Kuwait's foreign exchange, crucial. So they always had a need to remain on working terms with Iran, decent terms with Iran, and vice versa. But now they rely on Iran for overflight rights because they're denied airspace. You mentioned the Saudis granting rights to a flight over. So their position on that was everyone may fly over Saudi Arabia. Well, there's certainly at least one exception. Qatari planes are not allowed. Now, it was observed at the time that there had been other flights to and from, flew to or from Israel to somewhere else over Saudi Arabia. That's true. But this was the first Israeli registered commercial plane that was granted permission. So it really was a bit of a breakthrough. And, again, there is that exception for Qatar. So Qatar is in a kind of a stranglehold in terms of access to the rest of the world by air, if not for the cooperation of Iran. So that's another very important thing. I mean, it's actually worth quite a bit of money to the Iranians as well. And it's invaluable to the Qataris. So they have to be careful. So I think they would like to do it, but they've strayed from that mediating role. They've taken sides, and they've been forced to take sides. In both are true. I think they took sides in a smaller dispute and ended up being forced to take sides in a bigger dispute. And now they're getting dragged into all kinds of disputes. And, once you go down this road, it's very hard. If you're going to be Switzerland or Oman or something, you can't be cute about it. You really have to be, you really have to sit there and watch the Holocaust and say, oh, well, we're neutral. You just can't, it's not an a la carte menu. It's a full menu, and it's pretty grim sometimes. Saudi Arabia, right. So Saudi Arabia, I think you put your finger on some really important things. Saudi Arabia, as I said, did give Bahrain permission to do what they did. There's no doubt, or at least they didn't object. I don't know how it was framed or anything, but if they had said, no, absolutely not, do not do this, I think it's hard. The UAE wouldn't even ask, so it wouldn't come up. But Bahrain would ask, and if they got a clear negative, absolutely not, then they would not have. So that alone indicates that they're open to this in the future, potentially for themselves. the Saudi media has clearly responded to all of this as generally a good thing. The MBS inflected. Let me put it this way. When you look at the way that King Salman, who's still the king, don't listen to any of this, de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, MBS. That's not true. He's not the de facto. He may be the day-to-day ruler. He may have a lot of practical authority, but the big decisions, when he wants to make them, are still the king's to make. And that's very clear. We've seen that again and again and again. So just, MBZ, Mohammed bin Zayed, is the de facto ruler of UAE, but MBS is not the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia. The king remains someone who talks about Israel as a fait accompli, as a reality, as something you have to adjust to, as a problematic presence in the region that is simply a fact of life that you must accommodate. MBS talks about Israel as a manifestation of Jewish nationalism, which is another non-Arab nationalism in a region with lots of non-Arab nationalism. So there's Persian nationalism and Turkish nationalism and Kurdish nationalism and Jewish nationalism in Israel and Palestinian nationalism next to it, and it's all normal. None of it's pathological. None of it's artificial. This is not a plot. This is not a distortion. This is not, some kind of a weird Frankenstein's monster thing put together in some lab in Geneva or New York, or it's just a normal thing. That's a big difference. Now, that doesn't necessarily give you a different policy right away, but it's a very different attitude. And you see that attitude is getting more and more expressed in Saudi media, both in the news and commentary, and during the Ramadan specials, which were really interesting this year, where the Ramadan specials paid a lot of attention to Jewish heritage in the Arab world. They didn't really deal with Israel, but they did there's been a lot of activity in the Gulf, which is really great, to depathologize Judaism. And as a consequence, eventually you depathologize Zionism. If Zionism is Israeli nationalism, see, Zionism doesn't really mean anything anymore. Once you have the Israeli state as an established fait accompli and an Israeli population that's almost all born there and born into it, and they didn't sign up for Zionism is just kind of it's just sort of a meaningless word. It gets invoked by cynical people, by Netanyahu or by Bashar al-Assad or something. It doesn't mean much. What you have in practice is a country, Israel, with a Jewish power center and a Jewish majority in theory anyway, and that is Jewish Israeli nationalism, which is really different than Zionism if you think about it. And I think this is something that the younger generation of Arab leaders in the Gulf, who are less emotional about all of this, have understood. Now, I think it is important to note that one of the reasons is the strategic diversification I mentioned. Another reason is Iran is perceived as an existential threat by Gulf Arab countries, and Israel is not, and it never has been, and not to the Gulf itself. And I think the exasperation with Palestinian leaders is real, very, very real. The idea that these people just take, they never give any, they never sit down and think, what are our interests? They never take our interests into consideration. This can be seen as whining, or it can be seen as, the fruit of a long time of not getting due consideration. It depends on your point of view. But when anyone who wants to understand the way Arab leaders think about the Palestinian struggle right now should watch all the parts of Prince Bandar's interview with Al Arabiya. It is precisely the way they think about it. And it is exactly like, it is so blunt in the fact that if you ask these people in private, they don't say more and they don't say less. Right? They say exactly that. And the key phrase that he used, or the key sentence was, the Israeli cause is fundamentally unjust, but they've had effective leaders. And the Palestinian cause is fundamentally just, but they've had ineffective leaders. And you attach to that this idea that they've never cared about our national interests, and it's a one-way street, and it's been going on for decades, and we're done. You end up in a situation where there's no longer a willingness to make decisions based on the justness of that cause, only on how to manage the volatile variability that it creates for your national security calculations. This is and then go back to all the things that I said about Saudi Arabia's calculations before. Final question: the Trump administration. Yeah, I think it's tainted by its relationship to the Trump administration, but it's also, the Trump administration is both a reason it happened and not a reason it happened. There's not a thing the Trump administration did to produce the circumstances that led to this development. Right? Anyone who believes that this was the secret plan of Jared Kushner in producing the Manama conference and then the Peace to Prosperity document last January, and then what he really wanted was to confuse everyone so then the UAE would come in the last minute and say, no, he's not playing five-dimensional chess. He's not even playing checkers. He's just smashing stuff. That's what he's doing. This is a demolition job. He is taking a sledgehammer to the two-state solution, to the Oslo Accords, to the 1993 Declaration of Principles, and that's what he's doing. He's smashing it up. All right. For reasons I said before, all these countries had an interest in doing this. It fell into their lap. The whole kerfuffle over annexation gave the UAE an excuse to say they were saving the API and saving the peace initiative and saving the two-state solution and saving the Palestinians from annexation, which probably wasn't going to happen, gave Netanyahu an excuse for getting out of it with very little pushback, except from the most extreme settlers, and gave Trump a chance to say, somewhat fatuously, but there's some truth to this, that all you regular systematic diplomats couldn't achieve this. I, with my transactional personalized diplomacy, did. Netanyahu wanted to give this to me, so he gave it to me. The MBZ wanted to give it to me, so he gave it to me. The Bahrainis, they all could have waited for Joe Biden, but they didn't. They gave it to me. Why? Because they love me, because I'm so nice. That's really what he's trying to sell. And at a personalized level, it's true. So if you want to think like a used car salesman, yes, that's right. You sold the old grandma's Buick and you got a good price for it. But actually, they were going to buy the car anyway. That's sort of the point. Now, does it taint it? Well, no, not in the long run. I think for two reasons. First of all, there is enough animosity about anything to do with normalization with Israel that Trump doesn't add much or detract much. Second thing is, if Biden wins, Biden's going to be the one to shepherd through the F-35s. He's going to get a good deal of the credit for it as well. And then other countries will join under Biden. And it's just it's a macro historical event that was going to happen with or without Donald Trump. And I don't think it helps him domestically, because no one, not even the craziest evangelical, maybe Sheldon Adelson, but I don't think so, is going to go to the polls and say, I know I'm going to vote for Trump because Netanyahu went to Manama and no, that's not the way US politics work. That's just not happening. Similarly, I don't think you're going to find anybody in the Arab world saying, I really like this deal, but it was done under Trump, so I can't support it. It's the last thing they're going to care about, really. It wouldn't have mattered who it was done under. The people who don't like it, and the people who like it, and so that's what I think of it.
Well, thank you very much. That was a very insightful discussion, and
Sure.
we're very grateful for
Excellent questions.
Joining us today. Yes, so we have some questions for you.
Great.
The first three questions all have to do with Palestinians, so maybe I will lump them together.
Yes.
Given what you've said about Palestinians being up the creek without a paddle, and given that, as you say, other Arab states are likely to join these normalization agreements, do you think that ending the occupation and establishing two states is a viable option? Similarly, what is your estimation that the normalization with Israel among Arab states will lead to a one-state solution in Palestine, Israel, with equal rights for Palestinians due to Arab pressure? And finally, will these overtures between various countries and Israel force various Palestinian groups to unite?
Yes.
And then associated, is there a role for Palestinians in the Western diaspora to pressure Palestinian groups for unity?
Okay, the easiest part of that set of questions to deal with is the last one. And I think the answer in the long run is yes. I think so. They have no choice. This Palestinian national movement is absolutely crippled by the fact that it has two major clumps of party interests, or two major sets of leaders with power in two different parts of Palestine. and they're creating very different sort of political systems and cultures around them. But neither of them thinks like national leaders, right? Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, if he were a national leader, if he thought like a national leader, he would have accepted the Egyptian plan to get back into Gaza, take over the crossings and the port area and the ministries, even though he would have had responsibility without enough money, even though Hamas would not discuss de-arming the Qassam brigades, and he would have entered into a Hezbollah-like situation with this militia. But a national leader would risk it, and it would have meant opening the West Bank up to Hamas again in places like Nablus, where they already have a big following, and it would have been risky on all fronts. You're asking Mahmoud Abbas to take a big risk. Well, guess what? That's what national leaders do. They take risks. They don't sit there and say, I don't like this. That's, you know who does that? The mayor of Ramallah does that. He thinks like a machine mayor of Ramallah. I'm not saying that's how he imagines himself. I'm sure he doesn't. But when you look at his calculations, that's what they end up looking like. That's what, that person would do. A national leader would not be that reticent about taking risks, right? They would do the safe thing, the minimally popular thing. It would say the minimally popular thing every time. And I think when you look at Hamas's policies, again, they tend to either be transnational, those who are really plugged into the Muslim Brotherhood movement, or Iran and the Quds Force. Some of the people in the Qassam brigades are still close to Iran. And then a lot of the Hamas leaders are really in deep with Turkey and others. And so either they're transnational or they're very localized. They're this little mayor emirate of Gaza thing. And they're thinking about how do they meet payroll, and how do they do this, and what about the water, and none of the real issues. But the point is, none of that is leading a national liberation movement. Maybe that was the trap of Oslo, right? Maybe that was it. Give these people, enough local power that even if they don't want it, they have it, and then either they have to give it up, or how can they transcend it? Well, there is only one way to transcend it, which is to come back together again. Is there a role for the diaspora? Absolutely, absolutely, because so much of the best thinking takes place in the diaspora. So much of the energy of the Palestinian movement, so much of the money of the Palestinian people is in the diaspora, that it's really essential not only to bring, I think, Hamas and its willing or unwilling constituency in Gaza, and Fatah and its willing or unwilling constituencies in the West Bank, plus the diaspora together again. It may be actually that things are so bad that the Palestinian national movement has to migrate back out of Palestine again. It may be that bad, right? Oslo may prove to have been such a horrible trap that the only way to get things going is to go back to the refugee camps where the PLO began, in the late 50s and early 60s, to go back to where Fatah began in Kuwait and other organizations like that. In other words, it may be necessary for the leaderships to simply divest themselves of the responsibilities of, I hope this is not the case, especially of the PA, because it would be a disaster in its own way. But recreating a national liberation movement under these conditions appears to be very, very, very difficult. If not, I mean, it's proving elusive. So I think that's really a problem. The second question you asked me had to do with, what was it? I want to work backwards. What was the second one?
The second one is one state solution.
Oh, the one state. Okay, yeah, that's really easy. That pamphlet I wrote, monograph. It's not a pamphlet. It's a monograph I wrote about it. It was really old, but I think it made one point that's still true, which is there is no one state solution. There is a one state reality. We have it. We've had it since roughly 1967. And everyone who thinks it's a good idea should ask themselves how they like it, because we have it. And you could tinker with it, but it's not going to be, if it's not radically changed into something fundamentally different, it's not going to be a solution. And imagining a fully integrated one person, one vote democracy, I think it's not, I mean, it's not plausible. It's not, there's no way to go from here to there. It's just not going to happen. What we can think in terms of is confederation. And I think that's not only, I think I don't know if it's doable between Israel, the Palestinians, or even better, Israel, the Palestinians, and Jordan, all three, to become a kind of very loose Benelux confederation or something. But that is one potential way of reframing a hybrid that looks to two-state solution people like a two-state solution, and looks to one-state solution people like a one-state solution, but it doesn't force questions that can't be answered, like what about the refugees? What about the stuff? You know, how much of Palestine was owned by Palestinians? How much of Israel was owned by Palestinians in 1948? That's documentable, easily documentable. That would need to be redressed in the context of a one-state solution, right? It's not doable, right? But a confederation might, and a confederation might be the answer in Iraq. It already is to some extent with the KRG. It might be the solution in Libya. It might be the solution in Yemen. It might be a solution in Syria. It might, the Middle East might, confederation might be a way out in a lot of Middle Eastern contexts. Whether that's plausible or not, I don't know. But right now, that it strikes me that's a lot more serious conversation than a kind of you know, pink polka dotted unicorn of South African style transfer of power without a South African style refusal to redress existing grievances. In other words, what was the deal in South Africa? It was very simple. You stop discriminating against us, and we won't take any of your stuff away, including civil service jobs. Everything was guaranteed. Nothing a single white person had in South Africa was taken away from them as a result of ending apartheid, except the privilege to continue discriminating and continue denying political power. That's a really good deal for both sides because of the relative disparity, demographic disparity. That doesn't exist in this case. The pressure on the Jewish Israelis is not there similarly, and I don't think there's any sense of any need to do that. So I wouldn't even bother talking about it, honestly. I think it's just, it's a, what do you call it? A thought experiment, a counterfactual in the extreme. It's where I think the action is thinking in terms of some kind of version of a confederated reality in which you can have both parties, maybe all three parties, if you want to throw the Jordanians in, because increasingly I think they are being dragged in. The big winners, by the way, in the UAE-Israel deal, other than UAE, Israel, and the US, and Trump especially, in the US in general, were the Jordanians. Because, you know, annexation in the West Bank is perceived as an existential threat by the Jordanians. I mean, they're terrified of it because it threatens a reality to happen fairly quickly where Palestinian nationalism, which has been excluded by mutual agreement from Jordan since 1970, since Black September, to remigrate to Jordan, again, simply for want of any other possible arena of expression, right? You're not going to give up on your dream of self-determination. You can't get it done in Israel. You can't get it done in the West Bank. You can't get it done. Where can you get it done? Oh, well, what about this place? Well, you agreed not to in 1970, and you've been very good about that. And they've been very good about not shooting you and the whole thing, and not keeping you from making money or anything like that. It's been a very healthy relationship, but it depends on the potential for Palestinian self-determination to be realized in mandatory Palestine. Otherwise, there's a real threat. It could, Palestinian national agenda could remigrate back to where it once was in the late 60s inside Jordan. And so obviously this is, the Jordanians are part of this mix. So that's my, there is a one state, but it's not a solution. So we can't, I mean, never allow this phrase one state solution to, it's like saying gravity-free Earth. Doesn't exist. It's you know, it's just silly. You know, we could have a post-national world where we do away with nation states, I think, first.
All right, well, let's move to the...
No, there was a first part, though, about the... And I'll keep it really brief.
It was...
Oh, two-state solution?
Ending the occupation.
Yeah, it's been answered. Yeah, same thing. Yeah,
so
okay.
Moving to the other side of the Arab world, what are Iran's options to counter this alliance or any future alliance?
Well, I'm not an Iran expert. And I'm not going to speak on behalf of Iran. I will say this, the arms embargo being lifted, was it yesterday? I think it was, is it today? It's the 18th, oh, it was yesterday. Okay, so the arms embargo theoretically doesn't exist anymore. So Iran can now buy and sell weapons, conventional weapons, right? Including missile parts and launchers and man pads, which is, you know, the big thing. But Freely. Now, there are these secondary US sanctions and other restrictions. There's an independent EU embargo until 2023. There are other restrictions, but I think Iran, I mean, Iran has a really weird, from my perspective, right? Again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I'm really not an Iran guy. And I think you should ask somebody who specializes in Iran. But I will say this. From my perspective, it looks to me like Iran has a choice. Part of Iran wants to integrate with the region and the world and is serious about a Helsinki in the Middle East. Right? When they say that, I think some of the people who say this in Iran are not kidding when they say they would like a concert of nations in the Middle East and they want their sphere of influence and they want their due, but they want an understanding with the other countries and a framework, a Helsinki-like framework. They don't use that term, but that's what they really mean, beginning in the Gulf waters and then expanding. And so I think there's a branch of the Iranian government and Iranian society that's really serious about this. But I think they have a problem, which is their main method of power projection in the region is antithetical to that model. And that is this cabal of non-state actors all over the Arab world, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Yemen, and possibly in Bahrain on a small level and elsewhere, indeed. And especially if you consider Hezbollah as a branch of the IRGC in Morocco too. I mean, for goodness sake. There is no way to have a concert of nations while promoting a bunch of sub-state quasi-national actors that have their own independent foreign policy and defense policy and armies and whatnot. So there's an absolute contradiction. And to my mind, Iran is really going to have to decide. And when Gulf Arabs say this, they say it in a fairly obnoxious way. They say Iran has to do, and Americans as well say, the neoconservatives and Trumpians and others, they say Iran has to decide whether it wants to be a normal country or a revolutionary movement. But what they mean is what I just said. I said it, I think, in a more polite and a more accurate way. Okay, but these two wings of these two Iranian or Iranian government impulses are pushing in absolutely antithetical directions, and you cannot make serious diplomatic progress without resolving which of the two national security strategies you are going to privilege and promote, and they are completely different roads, in my opinion. So that's my answer. I'm sure it's not what people are hoping for. There are lots of great Iran scholars out there.
Next would be, do you think that the newly discovered offshore gas fields in Israel have been a factor for improving relations between Israel and some Arab countries? And I would add to that, generally, the geopolitics of the Eastern Mediterranean.
Yes.
What is that role?
So, very interesting. Yes, in fact, directly with Egypt, right? Because they just signed this Cairo agreement. They've just created what amounts to a kind of a bloc or even a cartel, right? With a bunch of European and Eastern Mediterranean countries led by Greece and Cyprus. You almost talk about them in the same breath in this context, but it's really an anti-Turkish, anti-GNA alliance, and therefore also by extension anti-Qatari in a way. So I think you can say that the Eastern Med has helped all the disputes involving Turkey. The rise of Turkey as a regional hegemon in the Middle East in general, and in the Eastern Med as well, and their claims on a huge chunk of the Eastern Mediterranean, this line they've drawn between northern Turkish coast and the coast off the shores of Tripoli, as the Marines like to say, but it's literally true, is such a huge grab. And the Turks have a point, by the way, that if you look at the Greek lines, which actually do correspond to international law, they do sort of squeeze the Turks out. I mean, the Turks, the rules as they're written do give the Turks a pretty lousy deal, but they are the rules as written. So you need to negotiate that. But instead, Ankara, as it is doing in every case, including Nagorno-Karabakh and everywhere, has become a very belligerent power. They've gone from, zero problems with our neighbors to zero neighbors without problems and zero interlocutors without problems. I don't know what the number of really sort of reliable allies they have is becoming very limited, but they're very passionate allies. So that obviously has helped to bridge, to solidify the Egyptian-Israeli relationship. It helps with the UAE. Doesn't make much of a difference with Bahrain, but it certainly doesn't hurt. And yeah, I think you can see a direct connection. Uh, it's really complicated though, because there's a difference between the political stance and the economic stance. Like for instance, Qatar is one of the heavy investors in Cyprus. So this is all very complex. And we did, I mean AGSIW, my organization, I moderated a really good panel on the Gulf role in the Eastern Mediterranean region that's on our website. And it's an hour and a half. I encourage everyone to go look at it. You'll never see a better discussion. Michael Tansham, a Turkish guy called Ali Bakir, and Cinzia Bianco. And boy, they brought it. They're really, really good. It's an hour and a half. I'm not going to give you an hour and a half. I just say yes. Yes, it does. And Turkey is the reason. It's not cooperation over LNG. Let's put it that way. It's about power and politics and influence.
After the Arab Spring, Egypt has emerged with a substantial overall recovery, suggesting its ability to survive as a united and strong power in the Middle East. While I see the least hope of it joining this deal, considering the legacy of the military commanders who have been in power and opposed Israel, doesn't Egypt have enough leverage with the Suez Canal, exceptional military strength, and overarching influence of Al-Azhar to prevent the weakening of the Arab stance against any policy that deprives the Palestinians of any hope of statehood and liberation?
No, I don't think so. I agree with you. I see Egypt emerging, but very slowly, very cautiously. The Egyptian economy is making an interestingly robust comeback, but it's very brittle. It's very leveraged. Egypt has borrowed a lot of money from a lot of people to get where it is, and it's still got the fun. Egypt has not found an answer. Again, I'm no economist, but it seems to me Egypt has not yet found an answer of how to get jobs for all, for its huge number of decently educated young people. And I don't know who can do that exactly. There's got to be a way eventually in the Arab world in general of bringing financial capital and human capital together, and that they've been kept as far apart as possible, and everyone has benefited from that except for most of the people. So I mean, Egypt, the ordinary Egyptian is a classic version of that, but you could say that about the ordinary Iraqi, the ordinary Syrian, the ordinary lots of different people. So I don't know how you do that, but my point is this: I don't think Egypt is yet in a position to set terms. I think they are emerging slowly from this cocoon. They've got a lot of problems on their immediate borders. They've got a volatile situation in Gaza, which they're constantly working, including working with Qatar, which Israel is also working with Qatar to keep the ball in the air in Gaza. Gaza's payroll of public employees is met by quarterly infusions of cash, literally flown in by Qatari officials at Israel's behest and Egypt's behest. Because if the balloon goes up and the lights go out in Gaza, guess who has to deal with it? Israel and Egypt mainly, and eventually the Jordanians too, but especially Israel and Egypt, because that's where Gaza is. So they have a vested interest in the basic, keeping life going in Gaza, so people don't just like completely and totally despair. It's bad enough as it is. So I think the Egyptians also have drawn a clear line in Libya. With the GNA forces and the Turkish and Syrian forces, Syrian Turkoman forces under Turkish control and others, about how far they're willing to let the GNA go towards Benghazi and Tobruk and these places in eastern Libya, and have been much clearer that they didn't have an interest, that the UAE did, in helping the LNA, Haftar's forces, try to take over Misrata especially, but also to some extent Tripoli. But above all, Misrata, right? That's the crucial place, the port. They weren't really that into that. But when it comes to defending the LNA's territory, they are willing to draw the line. So that they've been very tough on that. They've got this very big problem with the Ethiopians and the dam, which is happening now as we speak. And looks like they've been making diplomatic progress, but it's a very volatile issue. They're heavily invested in the success of the Sudanese experiment. So they've got so much heavy lifting on their own borders, plus the LNG thing, right, off their coast. Everywhere they look, they've got a big problem. And I don't think right now they have yet the bandwidth for the Palestinian issue. I do think Egypt is the best bet to return to a position of Arab leadership of the traditional Arab powers. And it's still true that like more than 1 in 3 Arabs lives in Egypt. It's still true. It's still the Arab country, by any measure of means, including culturally, certainly demographically, and in just about every way. But it's going through a hell of a time, largely self-imposed, for decades now. I mean, I'd say you'd have to begin with the Nasser era to diagnose what's gone wrong in Egypt, maybe even before. The point is, coming out of it is going to be very, very difficult. I think it's still very brittle economically, very brittle politically, and it's going to have a hard enough time in the coming years calming down its immediate environs. Right, there's problems on all sides there that I just described. I just drew a circle around Egypt, and there's a problem on every side before they can take up the Palestinian cause again. And of course, remember, Egypt was the first country to make a separate peace with Israel. Right, it became what this Abrahamic stuff, this normalization between Israel and Gulf countries indicates for Palestinians, by the way, which is something I should have said, and I'm glad I haven't finished here without saying it, is that Palestinian-Israeli conflict is now going to be local. It's not going to be international. It's not going to be regional. It's going to be local, or if you think in one state or confederated terms, domestic. But it's not really domestic. It's localized, right? We're back to the mandatory period, but without the British, right? So the Israelis are both the Jews and the British mandate at the same time, and the Palestinians are still the Palestinians. Okay, point being, that I don't think they're going to be looking, I think they would be unwise to look to Egypt or the Gulf or the UN or Russia or China or Turkey or Iran or Saudi Arabia or anybody to help them craft their new future. I think they're in a situation where now the pretending that the Arab Peace Initiative is the key to the future is done. And that tells you we're in a local struggle, folks. This is localized. That's why one state solution rhetoric might actually be very powerful. It's not going to work as a strategy, but it might be an interesting rhetoric, an interesting narrative, but you'd have to develop one that was not entirely reflective of a Palestinian narrative, which the current versions all are, so that you could start breaking through to Israelis of conscience. And so that if you were really into that, the first thing you'd have to do is create an entirely new narrative about the history of the conflict. Right? This, again, is something the ANC had from the beginning. From the beginning, the ANC cast itself as the completion of the Boer rebellion against the British, of the liberation of the South African peoples. They threw out a line to the Boer South Africans from day one that they conceivably could have embraced, and eventually they did. There's nothing like that in the Palestinian narrative about Israel. Nothing, in the beginning of it. You better get one. If you want to go down the one-state solution line, you cannot do it. You can't even begin to do it with this narrative, where they're all bad and you're all good, and it's all just a crime and et cetera. It won't work. They won't listen to it. Why would they? They won't.
Well, with that, allow me to thank Dr. Hussein Ibish and Professor Jamshid Choksi for a really fascinating hour and a half. I so wish we could all have been in one room. We will reconvene at the first opportunity when we are able to do so safely. But in the meantime, I thank you both. I thank our audience, and we look forward to reconvening when we can. Thank you very much for a delightful and thought-provoking discussion.
It's been a real honor, Professor Strabadi, and thank you very much, Professor Jamshid. I appreciate it very much indeed. And thanks to the Indiana University as well.
Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.